So, in science, one should question, one should doubt, one should think of alternate ideas. So this is a scientist's job. If you believe what your teacher says, or think that, oh, I read this in a textbook, it must be true, or I read it on this website, it must be true, then you're not doing your job. So if someone were to hear of a conclusion made in a scientific paper, or read something in a textbook, or even consider, say, a biological theory, even one that has a great amount of evidence, if one then doubts that or questions that, that's actually good. In science, you're doing your job. And so it is fine to doubt evolution. You should question it. It is fine to propose alternate models, such as the creation model or the intelligent design model. And so as I can consider then the fossil record, we do so because the next step after proposing a new model is not let's teach this as, alongside each other. So for example, if one says, oh, well, evolution may be one of the fundamental ideas in biology, one of the best proven theories in all of science, and it is, and so saying anything otherwise is just misrepresenting an enormous amount of scientific information. You can say, I have an alternate idea. Good for you. Evolution could be wrong. But your hypothesis is not now equivalent to one of the best proven theories in science. And so therefore you must now make predictions that then get tested. And that's how science works. No authority is ever used to accept a conclusion. Nothing is true because the teacher said so, or the textbook said so, or this website said so. It's because the evidence supports it. And so when we consider these models, the creation model, the design model, and the evolution model, they all make predictions about, in this video, I'd like to consider the fossil record, but also about anatomy, genetics, embryology, and other fields. And so if they make predictions, then the next step is to say, all right, let's study fossils and see which model has support. Now, the difficult thing for me in this video is going to be, I intend this to be a very quick overview because the students that I'm preparing this for, that's how this topic is treated in their course, as a quick overview alongside anatomical genetic evidence, etc. I also teach a course on prehistoric life where the focus for an entire semester is fossils. So as you can see on my videos and my YouTube channel, I have a very large quantity of videos, and I would love to get into all of this in much greater detail. But once again, the purpose of this video is to offer kind of a quick overview. And to be honest, the way that I'm going to approach it is I'm going to start with a very quick overview and then go back through it a little more slowly, just because different students come at this topic with different levels of interest and different amounts of time that they want to invest in this. So if we have these three models about how modern life got to be the way that we see it is, we then ask, well, what are these models? And then what predictions do they make? So the creation model is fairly simple in that if you look at the great diversity of life alive today, you have all of those, fish, those insects, that horse. The creation model holds that, in the first week of life, that these all appeared. So that when one goes back to the beginning of life on Earth, these fish were here. Every modern kind of fish, every modern kind of mammal, every modern kind of tree, every modern kind of coral, of insect, of everything that we see outside goes back to the beginning of life on Earth. Now, maybe there were some fossil animals that became extinct, but the easy thing to be tested is if you then go into early rock layers and find the kinds of modern fish and the kinds of modern mammal and the kinds of modern insect. That then is proof of the creation model. So here's a prediction. Modern kinds have always existed. So then go back to old rocks and find evidence of modern kinds. If you do, that is support for your model. The evolution model does not hold that. The evolution model holds that modern kinds haven't always existed, that the early animals would be the ancestors of modern kinds, and far simpler. So in the evolution model, the way to test that is that if we go back to early rocks, we do not find evidence of modern kinds, but instead we find their ancestors, simpler organisms from which the modern kinds evolved. There is a variation on the creation model, a little bit different, but synonymous to a large degree, called intelligent design. The main argument of intelligent design is that complexity cannot evolve in stages, so that you can't have half an eye, half a cell, half a skull, half a heart, half of whatever, that certain things you either have to have the whole thing or nothing. Nothing makes any, has any adaptive value. What good is half an eye? You can't see with it, and so you would just die. What good is it if you're half adapted to water and half adapted to land? You don't work well in either, and you would just die. So intelligent design argues that complexity kind of has to appear, all right? That from nowhere, here's a fully functioning eye, here's a fully functioning brain, here's a fully functioning whatever, because the complexity that one would say see in a brain or an eye or a skeletal system or the arthropod head or adaptation to land, etc. That complexity could not develop in stages. You could not have animals that have some, but not all of the parts of a complex structure or system, etc. That's great. And that's also very easy to test. One can look back then in the fossil record and then say, all right, let's look and see if the organisms in this time period then had some, but not all of the complex features or complexity that we would see later. So do organisms here have some, but not all of the features of complex, anatomical structures like skulls or brains or eyes? Do organisms have some, but not all of the features of an arthropod or a mammal or the adaptation to land? So in intelligent design, we should not expect intermediates, organisms which have some, but not all of the features of the complexity which later and more modern organisms have. The evolutionary model, on the other hand, would claim that, yes, you would expect to see transitional forms, intermediates, which have some, but not all of the features which will come later. Now, the evolutionary model then also is easily testable because when one studies anatomy and physiology, and genetics, it is then obvious that biologists are going to classify life into groups, into a family tree, that humans are classified as apes because of the things that they share with them. And we could say, put, the beginning of the apes, the common ancestor of the apes, let's give that a number 23. And then humans are classified in a slightly bigger group, an order called primates. Humans are classified as placental mammals, as therian mammals, as amniotes, as tetrapods, as vertebrates, as eukaryotes, etc. There is a nested hierarchy of groups, a family tree with branches close to the base of the family tree and then higher up. Well, this then makes predictions, as good models should. All right, in science, one then tests one model. So if this is accurate, if life evolved in this family tree, then the earliest fossils should be of the simplest organisms at the base of this family tree, the bacteria. We should then see branches leading to protists, fungi, plants. We should then see branches for simple animals, which should come before branches of more complex animals. We should see branches to fish long before amphibians or reptiles. So there is a set of predictions made. So once again, the creation model holds that all of these exist, going back to the earliest periods in time, whereas the evolution model predicts there is a specific order that one will see these organisms in. So we have 3 models. Once again, that's good. It's good to doubt, to question, to challenge, to think of alternate ideas. The next step then, however, is how do we test these? And all 3 of these models have predictions that they make about fossils. The evolution model holds that modern organisms haven't always existed, that you will see a progression of life's forms following pretty much the branches of the nested hierarchy of taxonomic groups alive today, and that you would see transitional forms, intermediate between groups with some but not all of complex features. Creation holds that all organisms have always existed. So you go back in Earth's time and you should find, well, among other things, every kind that's alive today. You would certainly not expect a pattern of organisms. If intelligent design is true, then you would not find fossils which are intermediate, which have some but not all of the features of later groups. Now, once again, let me kind of go through this twice, once with just really quick stills, and then once with some videos. And then if you have any further interest in this, I have lots and lots of videos because I base an entire course on this. So the earliest living things are just bacteria. Right? Bacteria have the planet to themselves for 1/3 of life's history. And then for about 1 billion years, there's more complex cells. And then animals appear. But they're very simple animals. Most have no fronts, no backs, no heads, no organs. They are very simple. So long before the Cambrian, and many creationists say, oh, life appears from nowhere in the Cambrian explosion. Clearly not true. Certainly not of animal life. Animal life exists for well over 60 to maybe 100 million years prior to the Cambrian, but they are very, very simple organisms and transitional in that the way that some of them get to be an appreciable size, so some of these are 3 feet long or even longer, is that they're so very flat. And if you're flat, you can get by without a circulatory system, a respiratory system, a urinary system, because diffusion can bring nutrients and waste in and out of your body with the surrounding seawater. And so life's complexity could evolve in stages. All right, we have animals which are microscopic even today. We have animals which lack circulatory systems and respiratory systems. And then there are these things. What are they? Kind of hard to say. They're not worms, but they're not arthropods. They seem to have some, but not all of the features of arthropods. These exist before any arthropods. So before arthropods are known, there are transitional forms with some, but not all of the features of arthropods. There are animals with some but not all of the features of mollusks or echinoderms. Once we get actually into the Cambrian, once again, we have animals with some features of arthropods, which aren't arthropods. We have very primitive arthropods, more primitive than any of the ones which come later. Very primitive mollusks, which resemble worms and have segmented shells. There are invertebrates which have features of fish, so they're not fish, but they have features that they share with fish that no other invertebrates have. So they have some, but not all of the complexity of fish. The simplest fish appearing in the Cambrian are, a couple of inches in length. They have no jaws, no bone, no pectoral and pelvic fins. So they have some, but not all of the features of the later fish. The complexity of fish develops in stages. So tens of millions of years later, fish have bone and then pectoral fins, and then they have jaws. The earliest jawless fish are not the fish of today. They are primitive. having features of not only modern bony fish, but also more primitive groups like cartilaginous fish and placoderms. Some fish adapt to live on land, and in their fins they have the same bones as amphibians would have in their arms or in their legs. The first amphibians are transitional forms. They are not frogs or salamanders, but they still have a number of fish features. Before there are modern frogs, there are transitional forms with some of the features of frogs. Before there are modern caecilians, which are legless, there are caecilians which have legs. Before there are flowering plants and trees, there are plants without vascular tissue that can't grow tall. Then there are plants which don't have leaves. And then there are plants which don't have seeds. And then there are plants which don't have flowers. And so plants take hundreds of millions of years to get to the complexity that they possess today. Before there are insects, there are arthropods with some of the features of insects, and there are primitive groups of insects extinct today with primitive features like thoracic legs and prothoracic wing-like lobes. The earliest reptiles still had amphibian features, and even then some features like small dermal scales from fish. The earliest snakes still had legs. Before there were dinosaurs, there were animals which had some but not all of the features of dinosaurs. Before there were birds, there were dinosaurs which had some but not all of the features of birds, including feathers. And so there are dinosaurs which are close to birds. Their arms are almost identical to wings. The earliest birds still retain dinosaur features. They have some but not all of the features of modern birds. And the modern traits of birds evolved over stages. Before there are mammals, there are reptiles which have some but not all of the features of mammals. And then mammal-like traits, mammal complexity, develops slowly over tens of millions of years as pelycosaurs evolve into therapsids, which evolve into cynodonts. Before there are humans, there are primates, which have primitive features. And then there are anthropoid primates. Later there are catarrhine primates. Later there are apes. Later there are apes of the family Hominidae. Later there are apes of the subfamily Homininae. And then there are hominids, which are upright walkers. We can see that from their position of the foramen magnum and other features, but their brains are still within a chimp range as far as size. And then we see over 2.5 million years changes in the genus Homo with species which look like us, with this prominent forehead and a cranium which is low and long. This the complexity of modern humans with our ability to perform endurance, running, our enlarged brain, etc. This evolves gradually over stages. Now, once again, I'd like to go through that again just a little more slowly, but 3 important points to be made. 1, the creation model holds that all modern kinds have always existed, and the fossil record overwhelmingly refutes that. Anyone who says differently could fine. Go back to the Paleozoic, the Cambrian, the Precambrian, the Archean, the Proterozoic, and find a tree. Trees aren't that hard to find. If you think that trees have always existed, specifically every modern kind of tree, find one. No one has yet. If you think that modern corals have always existed, they form reefs which are rock hard, which can stretch 100 miles. It's not that hard to find. So if you feel that modern reefs have always existed, find one. No one has yet. If you think that fish with their bone or arthropods with their hard outer shells go back to the beginning of life on Earth, then fine. That's a great hypothesis. Go out and test it. It is not a conclusion until the evidence to support it has been found, and it simply hasn't. Saying anything else is just misrepresenting the scientific evidence. With intelligent design, the argument is that you can't have animals which have some but not all of the features of mammals, but there are, or some but not all of the features of dinosaurs, but there are, or some but not all of the features of birds or arthropods or fish or any group, but there simply are. Saying otherwise is simply false. So I'd like to go through this again, but just the conclusion is the fossil record overwhelmingly supports the evolutionary model's predictions and overwhelmingly refutes the predictions of other models. Now, once again, going through this more slowly is as we look at the history of our planet, it's different than what we thought it would be. All right. So in the old days, people looked up at the night sky and they said, oh, I don't think those stars are very far away from us. I think that the Earth is essentially the center of the universe. And it turns out they just, had a very human-centered idea of space. They couldn't conceive that the universe is a big place and that humans weren't in the middle of it. In the same way, early humans couldn't conceive of long expanses of time. They kind of assumed that, history began with humans, essentially, and it would end with humans. The idea of, humans being latecomers in the history of an ancient planet, this didn't occur to them. And as we study the rocks, the geologists have, overwhelmingly supported this geologic timescale, where we separate Earth's history into eons. The Hadean eon, starting 4.5 billion years ago, the Archean eon, the Proterozoic eon, which ends around, say, 500 million years ago, 500 million years ago. And then all the fossils, which I'm mostly going to focus on being in this final 500 million years of the Phanerozoic eon. Now, when we think of life's groups, almost all of them are confined to the Phanerozoic eon. All right. Now, once again, you could say, I don't believe that. I question that. I doubt that. Good for you. Fine. But once again, if you want to make the prediction that modern life's groups have always existed, then in the science, the next step is for you to then test that. So look for fish or dogs or bugs or corals or trees in the vast majority of life's history. All right. So once again, trees aren't that hard to find. Fish aren't that hard to find. Mollusk shells aren't that hard to find. If you think that they've always existed, find some. All right. That would support your model. No one has. And so what apparently the history of our planet was once life began, a third of life's history had only bacteria. Nothing else is known. And then for a while, there were more complex cells as well. And then long after that, there were animals. So animals have not existed for the majority of Earth's history. No vertebrates would exist until the Phanerozoic eon. And so life's complexity apparently developed in stages, even at the cellular level. Primitive cells are known long before more complex cells, which have a larger size, nuclei, etc. And so prokaryotic cells, these are bacteria. These are the only fossils known for about 1.5 billion years, about a third of the history of life on Earth. One of the big things that happened in the Precambrian was that about 2.5 billion years ago, slightly later than that, a new type of bacteria evolved called cyanobacteria, what we often call blue-green algae. They performed photosynthesis in a way that released oxygen gas as a waste. And the rocks tell us this. Not only do fossils of prokaryotes, fossils of cyanobacteria appear for the first time, but now also oxygen starts to build up in the atmosphere, and you can measure that in the rocks. all of a sudden you have these vast red beds where iron precipitates out of seawater because there was oxygen to rust this in. Had, photosynthesis releasing oxygen always been around because of blue-green algae, or plants, then this would have happened from the beginning of Earth's history and not all at one time, 2.5 to 2 billion years ago, the majority of it. And so 2 billion years ago, shortly after oxygen is introduced into the air, more complex cells appear in the fossil record. And then from the design standpoint, you could say, is this an example of complexity kind of appearing out of nowhere? Well, no, not quite, because these cells are modified. They have lots of traits from bacteria. So we see in bacteria the genes which will make the eukaryotes successful. And one of the things, the primary things that makes eukaryotes successful is that there are bacterial cells living inside larger cells. So my eukaryotic cells have mitochondria in them. The cells of plants have chloroplasts in them. But when we look at mitochondria and chloroplasts, it appears that they are the size of bacteria, the shape of bacteria. They by fission like bacteria. They have circular chromosomes like bacteria. They're sensitive to the antibiotics that bacteria give us. So it seems that these cells evolved prior to eukaryotic cells. These cells evolved prior to eukaryotic cells, but then these cells living inside a larger cell then gave rise to eukaryotic cells. And so these represent then stages for the complexity of cells. The eukaryotic cells which we know today, such as the different kinds of algae, fungi, dinoflagellates, diatoms, etc., they don't all appear in the Precambrian. Many are known later, as can be shown by the fossils. Many paleontologists specialize in the fossils of microscopic life. It is not until the end of the Precambrian that the first animals are known. Now, the first animals include very simple animals, including what have been interpreted as sponges, which are the simplest animals alive today, and then a number of simple animals like cnidarians and later worms. Now, we can argue a little bit about these fossils because, if you have, fossil impressions of things which are an inch long and soft bodied, they are a little difficult, to interpret. There's no organs, there's no hard parts, etc. But once again, the evolutionary model predicts that it would be the simplest animals which would be found first, and that is certainly what is true. Long before the Cambrian period, tens of millions of years, there are very simple animal fossils. As we progress then through the late Precambrian, there are fossils of worms, and just before the Precambrian ends, it seems that there are fossils a little bit more advanced than worms. Transitional forms which seem to have some but not all of the features of arthropods, some but not all of the features of mollusks, etc. There are more complex worms which seem to be segmented and have a complete digestive tract, unlike the simplest worms, which do not have a complete digestive tract. So now a new time period begins, the Phanerozoic Eon and the Paleozoic era, which begins with the Cambrian period. Now this is when fossils start to get exciting, because for the first time we have big fossils. Many have hard parts like shells, and later by the end, bone of fish. And so now there's a rich assortment of fossils. Now, the Cambrian is not only, an exciting time period, but the fossils here are rather unique in that very often fossil beds don't preserve soft-bodied animals. They just don't last very long, and that when they die and they're decomposing in the mud, there are worms burrowing through the mud, and that disrupts, their body remains, and so that we don't have good fossils of them. But that wasn't the case in the Cambrian. Very often there are fossil beds which were not disturbed to a great degree. And so Cambrian fossil beds often preserve soft-bodied animals better than what happens later. So if you would like a representation of, say, a complete ecosystem, very often these Cambrian fossil beds, they do just that. So if you want to test hypotheses, I think that there have always been modern kinds of fish. The Cambrian is perfect because it preserves seemingly, more a complete representation of ecosystems than is typical afterwards. And there just aren't modern fish. There just aren't, even when there are fish, they are not modern fish. Even though the Cambrian has the first arthropods, they are not modern arthropods. There are mollusks, but not modern mollusks. There are corals, but not modern corals, maybe the corals in the next period. For the first time, certainly modern corals do not appear for hundreds of millions of years. And so even once animals appear, they were very, very different animals. Now they do then become more complex. Mollusks appearing in the Cambrian, but then more complex mollusks appearing later. They certainly do look like octopi and squid, but they would be different extinct groups for a long time. The only armored squid-like animal which lives today is the nautilus. And so even though there were mollusks, they weren't the modern mollusks. Long before clams became a dominant form of shellfish, there was another group, the brachiopods, which was the dominant a group, mostly extinct. Long before there were any modern arthropods, there were extinct groups like trilobites and sea scorpions. And so certainly the modern groups have not always existed. And before there were arthropods like these trilobites, there were animals which had some, but not all of the features of arthropods, transitional forms. And so that prediction is also met. So there were simple animals which had, legs but no hard exoskeleton, or compound eyes but no legs, or legs but not jointed legs, and certainly not the arthropod head. The arthropod head is very definitive of the group with the complex fusion of segments, and this occurs in stages. So there are animals which aren't quite arthropods. The first arthropods still are missing some of the complexity which will occur later in the group, etc. Now, later in time, arthropods do make it out onto land, but before there are, say, spiders or scorpions on land, there are sea scorpions in the water, and there are animals which have some but not all of the features of spiders. Even once there are true spiders, they are not the spiders of today. And whether it be the position of the spinnerets or the segmentation of the abdomen, spiders evolved in stages. Modern spiders are not known from the beginning. Insects are eventually known on land, but their modern insects do not appear. When insects appear, there are not butterflies and grasshoppers and ants and termites and bees, etc. Once again, if you feel that all modern kinds of insect have always existed, well, here's a challenge: find some. No one has yet. The earliest insects were all wingless and had a number of features like thoracic legs, or the early winged insects had lobes on their thorax, which is suggestive of how the first wings evolved. The simplest wings could only be held outright for gliding and not for flying. And so insect groups seem to have evolved in stages. So there are insects from the Paleozoic, from 500 million years ago to 250. Other insect groups, appear in the Mesozoic. So for the first several 100 million years of insects, there are no ants or bees. And once again, if you were to claim otherwise, find some, and that would be proof of your model. No one has yet. There are, just like today, we have chordates, which have some but not all of the features of vertebrates. The fossil record has some in the Cambrian as well. So there are features which are definitive of the chordates, which would include fish and all other vertebrates, like a notochord, a support rod, or the fact that the heart tends to be on the front and the nerve cord on the back, or a postanal tail, or a throat with slits where gills go. Well, in the early Cambrian, there are invertebrates which have these features that will define the fish and the vertebrates that no other invertebrates have, like a notochord, a postanal tail, etc. The first fish evolved in the Cambrian, but they are not bass or sunfish or marlin, etc. Instead, they're just an inch or two long. They have no bone, they have no pectoral and pelvic fins, they have no jaws. Fish complexity then increases gradually over tens of millions of years. There are later jawless fish with bone. There are, after that, jawless fish which have pectoral fins, which are important because at some point we'll be talking about arms on amphibians. And so the complexity of fish evolves in stages over tens of millions of years. Even once jawed fish are exist. Once again, it's still not bass and marlin and trout and the like. It is an extinct group known as the placoderms, which don't have true teeth with enamel and dentin. Primitive sharks, unlike any sharks alive today. Fish which may be intermediate between sharks and bony fish, known as acanthodians. And so the fish of the Silurian, the Devonian periods, they include jawed fish, so fish are becoming more complex, but still not the fish of today. So this then goes on, and the groups of fish alive today evolve very gradually, whereas you go through time, you would see, the first bony fish. But then it would still be another 100 million years before you see the teleost group, which is the dominant group of bony fish alive today. And then still, tens of millions of years after that, before you would see modern orders and later modern families of fish. Now, one group of fish interests us a great deal. This is the group of sarcopterygian fish. Now, they're not very common today. They were never the dominant type of fish, but they are exciting, all right, because today some actually have true lungs, not lung-like things, they actually have true lungs. They have the same bones in their fins in the fossil record as amphibians would have in their arms and legs. And as we go through group after group of these sarcopterygian fish, over tens of millions of years, we see fish which have some but not all of the features which adapt amphibians to life on land. They become more and more like amphibians gradually until amphibians evolve from sarcopterygian fish. Once again, the same bones that amphibians will have in their arms and legs exist in the pectoral and pelvic fins of these sarcopterygian fish. So a fish which has arm and leg bones, by definition, that is a transitional form, having some but not all of the features of the amphibians. The adaptation to life on land could evolve then in stages. So lungs is something that evolved in the sarcopterygian fish. As you notice this lungfish going to the surface to take a gulp of air. All right, and so it was not a question of, as many, people will sometimes claim that a fish has to have, say, one mutation that turns it into an amphibian. What happened is that a bag, which was already present in bony fish, the swim bladder, and which was already being used for gas exchange, then became paired bags, which then became lungs. This is a process of tens of millions of years that this could be perfected. And then the sarcopterygian fish, which already had lungs, got better at moving on land as bones in their fins just became stouter. The very first amphibians are mixes of both primitive and advanced features. They're more advanced than fish. They have a neck, they have fingers and toes, they have arms and legs, but they're primitive. They still have a notochord running from head to tail. Some of them, like Acanthostega, don't have an ankle or a sacrum so that the leg is not able to support the body's weight on land. They still have bones supporting internal gills. They still have these bony rods in their tails, adapting their limbs more for or their tails more for swimming than for movement on land, and a bunch of other traits as well. So the first fish, the Devonian fish are transitional between more primitive fish and the amphibians. And then the first amphibians are transitional between these sarcopterygian fish and the later amphibians. So once amphibians appear in the fossil record, they are not frogs and salamanders. That will not, they will not appear until the Mesozoic era and the age of dinosaurs. We have a number of primitive forms which still retain primitive features. So for example, it takes a while for the number of digits to go to 5. So some primitive amphibians have 8 digits, some had 7, some had 6. The intelligent design often makes the argument, well, what good would it be if you were, say, half adapted to life on land? You wouldn't be good as a fish or an amphibian, you would just die. Well, clearly that's not the case. I mean, there are even organisms today which, are intermediate between fully aquatic and fully terrestrial. But certainly in the Devonian, having some ability to move over land would give you the ability to migrate, to lay your eggs in pools where you would have been safe from predators. It would have given many advantages. Later, after the early amphibians of the late Devonian, there are then the first anapsid reptiles, which still have amphibian features. So when reptiles are first known in the fossil record, they are not the reptiles of today. There are these little insect eaters which still had a number of primitive traits which no modern reptiles have. As reptiles adapted to land, they then split into different lineages. One of the easy ways to distinguish between them is the number of holes for jaw muscles. So there are synapses which have 1 opening, diapsids which have 2. The diapsids would be the ancestors of things like crocodiles, lizards, snakes, and birds. The synapses would actually evolve into mammals. And as the end of the Paleozoic era approaches, a number of those reptile lineages were diversifying. Now, just to catch up with life on land at this point, in the Precambrian, there are no plants at all. So if you would like to argue that plants have always existed, great, find some. No one has yet. And so plants have not always existed. When plants are first known, they are not vascular plants which can grow tall. Once vascular plants appear, they are not plants with leaves. Leaves come later. Once there are plants with leaves, they don't have seeds. Seeds come still later. Trees come long after the first plants. So plant diversity evolves in stages as documented by the fossil record. Flowering plants aren't known until the Mesozoic and in the age of reptiles, the age of dinosaurs. So the Paleozoic era stretches from say 540 some million years ago to oh, I'm sorry, I should say to 200 million years ago. And as we get into the very last period, the Permian period, we see by this point some of those synapsid reptiles have evolved some of the features of mammals. So these are still reptiles, but they are the first of the mammal-like reptiles. Once again, transitional forms. Later, there are therapsids, which have even more mammalian features. So the pelycosaurs are transitional between earlier anapsid reptiles and later groups. But from them evolved the therapsids, which are transitional between the pelycosaurs and later groups. By the very end of the Permian, the very first of the cynodonts had appeared, which is the most mammal-like in the mammal-like reptile groups. So at the end of the Paleozoic, mammalian complexity was evolving in gradual stages, unlike the prediction of intelligent design. So this is one of those therapsid mammal-like reptiles. And this group was doing rather well in the Permian period. They were transitional. They were, arguably halfway between the ancestral reptilian condition and mammals. What happened to them? Well, the Permian period ends as the last period in the Paleozoic era, so thus the Paleozoic era ends with the worst mass extinction in the history of the planet. Creationists often argue that all life has always existed up until a couple thousand years ago when one single global cataclysm affected life's diversity. The fossil record simply demonstrates otherwise, that there have been periods of mass extinction throughout the history of the Earth, that not all of these organisms have existed at the same time. Some went extinct in the Cambrian, some went extinct in the Devonian, at the end of which there was a mass extinction. And much of Earth's diversity went extinct at the end of the Permian, when it is thought that the effects of not only the fusion of the continents forming the supercontinent Pangaea, which would have changed ocean currents and made many areas much drier, but also the largest volcanic eruptions in Earth's history were known in Siberia, known as the Siberian traps. Later in the Paleozoic, there had been an ice age on the southern continents, which were occupying the South Pole at this point. So life's diversity is affected by the position of continents, the movement of continents, volcanic eruptions such as the eruptions which went on, for just hundreds of thousands of years in Siberia, or a million years, resulting in 1 to 4 million cubic kilometers of lava. This then drastically changed life on Earth and put an end to the Paleozoic. Now, the Paleozoic era, its name literally means old life. signifying that the living groups alive at that point, they aren't the kind that we would see today. And when the Paleozoic then ended, then began the Mesozoic era 250 million years ago, middle life. During this period, the first turtles are known, but these are clearly transitional forms. While they have thick ribs and a shell on their underside, a plastron, they don't yet have a carapace. They had teeth, and so there were different groups of primitive turtles. So once again, the earliest turtles were transitional forms, intermediate between previous reptiles and the later turtles. Before the turtles, which could withdraw their shells inside their necks, appeared, there were turtles known as the side-necked turtles. Before there were the many diapsid groups alive today, there were primitive diapsids, which would give rise to early lizards, the ancestors of the tuatara, although that animal still alive today had a number of primitive relatives long before there was the tuatara. The earliest snakes had hind legs, and one was recently found which had its front legs as well. So these are transitional forms. Before there were snakes, there were animals which had legs like their ancestral lizards. And then before there were crocodiles or birds, there were dinosaurs. There were more primitive, what are known as archosaurs. Archosaurs, the name literally means the ruling reptiles. And it is this group that would give us the crocodiles, the dinosaurs, and the birds. And so archosaurs diversified in the first period of the Mesozoic era, the Triassic period. And we can see transitional forms. So all of the bones needed to make, say, the skull of a crocodile or the skull of an early dinosaur were present in these early archosaurs. Crocodiles are first known from the Triassic period, but they are not the crocodiles of today. Modern crocodiles would evolve over tens of millions of years in gradual stages. So the early crocodiles were quite different. Some were 1.5 feet long or 3 feet long. Some were capable of bipedal locomotion. And so crocodiles have evolved in stages, and modern crocodiles certainly have not existed since the beginning of the history of life, and certainly not since the beginning of the history of crocodiles. The Triassic period had a great diversity of forms which would become extinct at the end of the Triassic period, like the phytosaurs and the Rauisuchians and many marine reptiles. Because just as the continents had come together, starting in the Carboniferous through the Permian, at the Triassic period, they would begin to separate. And so the Atlantic Ocean would begin to form at the end of the Triassic period. And there was a great amount of volcanic activity associated with this event. And so many of the animal groups which lived during the Triassic period, they became extinct. Many of the ancient crocodiles, those phytosaurs, Rauisuchians, marine reptiles, etc. Now, the Triassic was noteworthy for a number of things. This was the first time that vertebrates would fly. Now, birds would come in the next period and bats long after that. The first flying vertebrates were another group called the pterosaurs, which had a very long fourth finger. Now, there were a number of reptiles of the Triassic which were not pterosaurs, which did have extended fourth fingers, not to this extent. So it seems that pterosaurs took a trait which other reptiles had, an extended fourth finger, and then adapted it to make a wing. The first pterosaurs were more primitive than those which would come later, and so not all pterosaurs appeared at once. The smaller rhamphorhynchid pterosaurs appeared in the Triassic, and the much larger pterosaurs, I'm sorry, pterodactyl pterosaurs would appear later in the Jurassic period. And so pterosaur complexity increased over time, and the groups then varied. Not all of them existed together. And then the same could then be said of the dinosaurs. Now, some have argued that dinosaur complexity was such that dinosaurs would have had to have appeared suddenly, and some have said that there's nothing that's transitional with some but not all of the dinosaur features. And that is simply not true. In the Triassic period, there were a number of archosaurs. Some are called thecodonts, or now the better term is dinosauromorphs. They have some, but not all of the features of dinosaurs. Dinosaurs were quite distinctive in their hips, their legs, their ankles, and there are transitional forms which have some, but not all of these features of the hips, legs, and ankles known in the Triassic as dinosauromorphs. When we think of dinosaurs, we often think of these huge, complex reptiles. Some have horns and frills, some have enormous sizes, being over 100 feet long. They are often very specialized. But the first dinosaurs were not that. The first dinosaurs in the mid-Triassic were 3 to 6 feet long, and they were unspecialized. They were bipedal, and they lacked the horns, the armor, the large size, and the other specializations which would come later. And thus, not all dinosaurs have existed since the beginning of life on Earth, and not all have existed since the beginning of the dinosaurs. That dinosaur groups would evolve in stages over time. And so once again, all of these are consistent with the evolutionary model and strongly refute the predictions of creation and intelligent design models. Elsewhere, I'll go into the dinosaur groups where before there were complex armored dinosaurs, there were transitional forms which had a little armor and were still bipedal. Before there were horned dinosaurs, which were large quadrupedal animals, there were small protoceratopsians, some of which were bipedal and had small frills or lacked horns. Before there were, hadrosaurs which could chew, there were more primitive ornithopods that couldn't. Before there were the big sauropods, which were quadrupedal, there was the earlier prosauropods, which were bipedal. Before there were very specialized theropods like the tyrannosaurs, there were much more generalized meat-eating reptiles. And so dinosaur groups evolved slowly, and there were many transitional forms which were known. The Triassic period was also known for the very first mammals. Over the majority of the Triassic period, there was a group of reptiles known as the cynodont reptiles, which became more and more mammal-like until it is hard to tell the difference between a cynodont reptile and a primitive mammal. So cynodonts were clearly then transitional forms. And the first mammals still had many reptilian features and were not the mammals of today. And so the Triassic period sees not only transitional reptiles, which are almost mammals, but then also primitive mammals, which are transitional between the cynodont reptiles and the mammals which would come later. Once again, the Triassic was a very exciting period in Earth's history, having witnessed the first crocodiles, the first turtles, the first dinosaurs, the first mammals, the first pterosaurs, and many other groups. But there was a mass extinction at the end of the Triassic, in large part due to the volcanic activity, as the southern and northern continents started to divide, which would have involved a great deal of volcanic activity as the Atlantic Ocean began to form. And many groups, including many marine reptiles, went extinct at that point. The Mesozoic era continued in the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods, but it should be stated that, once again, the creationist prediction is that all kinds of life appeared at the beginning and continued until one single mass extinction several thousand years ago. And that just simply isn't observed. So when we take the groups of, say, theropod dinosaurs, or any group of dinosaurs, some are only known in the Triassic period, some are only known in the Jurassic period, some are only known in the Cretaceous period. And so whether it be different groups of dinosaurs, different groups of birds, etc., what we see is a gradual unfolding of a family tree over time, not a sudden appearance of complex organisms, which exist until fairly recently. And along this, gradual evolution of the family trees, we could see increases in complexity, so that there are traits which evolve at each branch, which are then found only in later groups, not in more primitive groups. So the complexity of these theropods, or even the first birds, appeared gradually over stages. Among the complex features evolving in the meat-eating dinosaurs was feathers. Feathers are known from primitive meat-eating dinosaurs. Some have even been preserved in amber, showing their transitional features. And then later groups even had flight feathers. Now, feathers serve many functions, not just flight. And so it appears that dinosaurs were using feathers maybe to keep warm, or for camouflage, or for courtship displays, or for gliding, before one group of theropod dinosaurs became the first birds by the middle of the Mesozoic era. So not only are there dinosaurs with transitional features like feathers and many of the anatomical skeletal features of birds, the first birds were then transitional features. Transitional organisms, not modern birds at all, but still having many features of their dinosaur ancestors, like clawed, grasping fingers, a long reptilian tail, teeth, etc. Bird complexity would increase gradually over time. Now, I'm going to just kind of jump to the end. We could say that with each of the lineages and talk about the transitional forms in sauropod history, where prosauropods then have some but not all of the features of the sauropods, or of the horned dinosaurs, or of the early birds, where for tens of millions of years there were primitive birds which were not the modern groups of birds, or the primitive mammals which existed during the Mesozoic. So the Mesozoic era gives rise to not only the first mammals, but then later the first live-bearing mammals and the first placental mammals, but not modern mammalian groups. These were primitive mammals with some but not all of the features of the later mammals. There are the first flowering plants appearing by the middle of the Mesozoic, and then a number of diverse lineages by the end, although most flowering plant lineages would occur afterwards. And so the Mesozoic era shows us that not all organisms have always existed, and that the various lineages slowly changed over time, including many transitional forms, which had some but not all of the features of later groups. By the very end of the Cretaceous period, 65 million years ago, there was volcanic activity in India known as the Deccan Traps, which was quite significant. And then also a meteorite struck the planet at the Yucatan Peninsula. And these two events together once again caused a mass extinction, so that much of the Mesozoic life became extinct, including the majority of dinosaurs. And when I say the majority of dinosaurs, since birds are technically descended from dinosaurs, then there would be some descendants of dinosaurs which survived, this mass extinction. The last 65 million years is known as the Cenozoic era. Now, while sometimes called the age of mammals, this is also the age in which the majority of the bird lineages alive today existed. So even though birds go back to the Mesozoic era, there were no hawks in the Mesozoic, there were no herons, there were no woodpeckers, and there certainly were no songbirds. So the family tree of birds evolved slowly and gradually, with the most common birds alive today, the songbirds being the last big group of birds to evolve. Most of the plants alive today evolved in the Cenozoic era. And I go through all of the lineages of mammals. I'm going to start to wrap up now, but in the Cenozoic era, certainly once the dinosaurs became extinct, it wasn't as if one could see dogs and bears and cows and all of these other mammals. The various lineages of mammals very slowly then adapted to the new world without dinosaurs. And so we see transitional forms in the elephant lineage, in the horse lineage, in the carnivore lineage, in all the mammal lineages. And my videos go through that as, you know, the modern, quote, kinds of mammals come about today. Then in the primates, the Cenozoic era begins with primitive primates, and then there are anthropoid primates, and then there are catarrhine primates, and then there are apes. Now, apes do have large brains for primates in general, and so notice that the modern chimp range is here, while modern human range is here. But there would be at the very end of the Cenozoic a number of upright walking hominins, which then start to have brain sizes partway in between modern chimp range and modern human range. Not at first. So at first we have then transitional forms, which are walking, but which still had brains within chimp range. And so so upright walking actually disappears. So things like example of some biomotion. Australopithecus would be better than Ardipithecus. Homo habilis would be better than Australopithecus. Homo erectus even better, and for the first time capable of endurance running. So when we consider the human form, it did not appear suddenly, but some existed in early mammals, some existed in early primates, a bit more in anthropoid primates, a bit more in catarrhine primates, a bit more in apes, a bit more in hominid apes, and then a bit more in Ardipithecus, Sahelanthropus, and Araran, a bit more in the Australopithecines, a bit more in the early members of Homo. And so whether one looks at the adaptations for bipedal locomotion, for cranial volume, etc., there are gradual transitions. So once again, the big points are modern organisms have not always existed. Even when we start to look at mammals, in the age of mammals, the Cenozoic, that there were not modern horses, carnivores, whales, etc. at the beginning of the Cenozoic. These groups evolved slowly, nor were there modern humans. Things like upright walking and then upright walking and cranial volume, they evolved slowly through transitional forms as the modern condition evolved. Homo erectus dates from the past 2 million years, and once again started to get a much larger cranial volume, much smaller than humans at first, but later Homo erectus actually within human range. Homo erectus was the first species to use fire that we know of, and Homo erectus has spread throughout the world. Now, by the end of this period, there were certainly plenty of species of Homo. So just as like there are lots of species of hawk, there are lots of species of frog, there were lots of species in the genus Homo, ranging from Homo erectus to Homo neanderthals to the dwarf species of Homo floresiensis living on the island of Flores. And so then from this diversity, Homo sapiens first appears 200 to 300,000 years ago. So in this very long history of our planet, which is 4.5 billion years old, we don't get mammals until say close to 200 million years ago. We don't get primates until 60 some million years, or I'm sorry, let's say 55 million years ago. We don't get apes until 20 some million years ago. We don't get upright walking apes in our clade until say 5 to 7 million years ago. We don't get the genus Homo until 2.5 million years ago. And we don't get Homo sapiens until 200,000 years ago. So once again, the claim that modern kinds have always existed simply isn't supported. We certainly see a set of transitions. And even to the point where it seems that the modern humans we have alive today resulted not only from that Homo sapiens group, which first appeared 200 to 300,000 years ago, but there also seems to be evidence of some intermating between Homo sapiens and other groups. So for example, I have alleles inherited from Neanderthals, we know from DNA sequences. So my Homo sapiens ancestors intermarried with intermated with some Neanderthals to get that inheritance for me. And we also know of another group in Asia known as the Denisovans, and some modern Asians have Denisovan DNA. And so in this diversity of human Homo species through the planet, it seems that while Homo sapiens has largely replaced the other groups, that there was some regional continuity where we think that there was some interbreeding between Homo sapiens with these other groups in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, to give rise to the lineages which occur today. And the spread of ice sheets in the last 2 million years of Earth's history then greatly affected Earth and allowed for the migration of some humans into the Americas when there was an ice-free land bridge connecting Asia and the Americas. Now, tragically, it wasn't just the expanse of ice sheets in the last 2 million years which had a devastating effect on life. In the past, 10,000 years, the great success of our lineage of humans as we spread throughout the world, we have caused a lot of extinction. And this is actually accelerating as we modern humans and our greatly expanding population causes more deforestation. As humans need more land for roads, for schools, for crops, for cattle, etc. And so geologists have potentially named this very last time in Earth's history as the Anthropocene epoch, because we are having such devastating impacts on wildlife that actually we think that we are having a role in the second worst extinction in Earth's history. But the focus of this video was to kind of give an overview of what I try to cover in a semester of prehistoric life. And I have obviously videos which go through this much more slowly. And we can see certain things are clear. One, modern kinds have not always existed. And not only that, but the appearance of fossil groups then follows a very gradual increase in complexity, with the first organisms being just bacteria, and then more complex cells, and then invertebrate animals, and then among the vertebrates, fish first, then amphibians, then reptiles, then mammals, etc. There's certainly are transitional forms. There are animals with some but not all of the features of arthropods, some but not all of the features of fish, of mammals, of humans, etc. And so the fossil evidence overwhelmingly supports the predictions of the evolution model and overwhelmingly refutes the predictions of the creation and intelligent design models. Any other statement simply is a misrepresentation of the scientific facts which have been published in the scientific research. Once again, I have far more information on this if you desired a greater coverage beyond this quick overview.